If you're curious to know how some people get invited to the Autism Oscar Awards, you're in the right place. So, you got your diagnosis or you're self-diagnosed and someone tells you this. Ever since your diagnosis, you've been acting more autistic. Join me as we look deeper into some of the possible reasons behind this being a thing. I wanted to take a little bit of a different approach by not only examining how other people perceive this, but also the confusing internal struggles some of us might feel about this ourselves, because I don't think enough of us are talking about that. But first, let's look at why other people might think this about us. Autism and ADHD are not observable physical injuries or disease that can be measured with labs. They're neurological and behavioral, which can produce an abundance of subjective gradations. Humans obviously have more control over their behavior, so consequently, many people conclude it's solely a matter of personal choice. If you're acting a certain way, you're choosing to act that way, and you could simply choose not to act that way. And people don't apply the same line of thinking to diseases or physical injuries. But what they don't realize is that most of us have been controlling our personal behaviors our whole lives. It's called masking. Everyone masks to a certain degree. People often alter their behaviors to minimize the discomfort of others or to be accepted by their peer group. A person might act differently around their parents or a boss, for example, than they would with their drinking buddy. Or maybe your boss is your drinking buddy. If so, no judgment, I see you. But for the most part, people usually adjust their behaviors to fit the situation. But when a neurotypical person masks, they're mostly just exhibiting social behavior deemed appropriate for the circumstances. When a neurodivergent person masks, it is a constant effort mimicking neurotypical behavior and suppressing their natural tendencies like stimming. They do it regardless of the social setting, and it's exhausting. I picture masking like a person standing on one foot, holding piles of fragile dishes in both hands while balancing books on their heads, all while trying to smile, act normal, and pretend their arms and legs aren't getting weak. They're getting exhausted, but they can't move because if they do, all the dishes will fall and shatter, and the books will slide off their heads. Now imagine standing that way for hours. How shaky would you start to get? How anxious and exhausted would that make you by the end? That's what masking feels like for a lot of people. Most people who are not yet diagnosed do this because they know they're different and can't quite figure out why. They just know they need to act normaler. But once they find out that there are terms that explain why they're so different, they begin trying to unravel a very tangled string of figuring out who they really are without the mask. It's a difficult thing to do, but slowly they begin to realize that they can conserve more of their precious energy reserves by letting go of some of that masking behavior. They try to set more personal boundaries, give themselves a little bit more alone time, and maybe they try not to suppress their urges to stim as much. Basically, we stop standing on one foot, put down the fragile dishes, take the books off our heads, and decide to rest in a chair for a few seconds, and people are like, whoa, why are you acting so different all of a sudden? But what they don't realize is that it was before that you were doing all the acting. Prior to your discovery, your acting was aimed at accommodating them, and now that you're trying to accommodate yourself a little bit, you're the bad guy who's putting on an Oscar-worthy performance. Lights and sounds still very much bothered me before my diagnosis. Certain scents evoked anger or physical discomfort. I had difficulty communicating my thoughts and ideas, which led to frustration, and I constantly felt the pressure of knowing I was different and didn't fit in. But what did I do with all of that? I stuffed it down and hid it. The funny thing is, I hear a lot of content creators say they thought everyone else had the same struggles and just hid it better, but I somehow inherently knew not everyone felt or thought the same way I did. But I didn't realize it was because we were experiencing the world differently. That might sound like a distinction without a difference, but it was like I understood we didn't have the same struggles. I just didn't know why we didn't have the same struggles. I somehow thought a lot of it came down to personal choices everyone else was making that were better than my own. I felt like I was making the choice to be bothered by irrelevant things and that I was a bad person. I thought me not fitting in meant I wasn't working hard enough to fix it. I basically thought I was choosing to be an angry 90-year-old trapped inside a 20-year-old's body. So I just hid it and lived being angry, not understanding why certain things felt harder for me. I certainly didn't make accommodations for myself like wearing earplugs in a noisy environment because no one does that. That's weird. Why would someone do that? No one else is bothered by this volume level. Why are you allowing yourself to be such a cranky old fart, Jennifer? I honestly thought being bothered by noise was a character flaw. Now that I realize noise does affect me differently than other people, I use my loop earplugs to take the pain away, and suddenly I'm acting more autistic. And the funny thing is, not being aware of why things bothered me or why everything felt like such a struggle became a circular source of anger for me. I didn't understand why things were making me angry, and I figured I just needed to get better at it. So I'd subject myself to more of it, which made me angrier, and that anger made me angry.
You wouldn't like me when I'm angry.
And now I realize why, growing up, my father seemed like he was angry about inconsequential things all the time. Everything seemed to bother him. If I stirred my ice cream in my bowl, he'd yell at me to stop. If I shuffled my feet as I walked behind him, same thing. He would click his tongue in anger if someone next to us in line was chewing their gum too loudly or popping bubbles. I thought he was just a heartless buzzkill. He was bad at communicating his thoughts and feelings. He was quiet most of the time, had very few friends, and often isolated away in a corner at family functions. As a little girl, I always thought he was choosing to be angry over nothing because I myself was not yet experiencing autism the way he was. I didn't begin to notice my social differences until middle school, and I didn't notice the extent of my executive dysfunctions and repetitive behaviors until I was living on my own. Now that I myself am a proud card-carrying autistic adult, I realized why he seemed so angry all the time. The biggest difference between him and I was that I simply masked better, which is what a lot of us do. We internalize it and hide it, which makes everyone think we're handling it just fine, and they don't see the exhaustion, depression, and anger we're quietly experiencing just below the surface. Once we realize our existence isn't just a string of character flaws we can change, we begin to make accommodations for ourselves in order to conserve our precious energy resources. But what that looks like on the outside is that you're putting on an act for things you were able to handle just fine before the terms autism or ADHD came into your life. You might start talking about it more too, which is a natural consequence of you beginning to understand the driving forces behind some of your behaviors. Once you begin making those connections and telling people about your realizations, they might think you're making it up or seeking attention. But there's a paradox that is born out of acknowledging all of these things out loud, and it's called the frequency illusion, or what I like to call noticing red cars. Why I like to rename all these concepts, I don't know. I just exist in the world this way for some reason. Anyway, frequency illusion is basically a process by which we use selective attention to create confirmation biases. If a person was told to notice red cars, they'd begin to see them everywhere, which might cause them to think there are more red cars on the road. But in fact, there are not more red cars on the road. They're just taking mental note every time they see one where they hadn't really taken a mental note of them before. This can also lead to recency illusion, which occurs when an individual notices something recently, making them convinced that it originated recently as well. So now that you're rightfully connecting certain behaviors to autism or ADHD when you'd never done that before, people might think you're creating your own confirmation bias or that these behaviors recently originated. They basically think you're fabricating red cars out of thin air when really red cars have existed since the early 1900s and they somehow just hadn't noticed them before you began pointing them out. As I was thinking about what I wanted to say in this video, I imagined a scenario that I thought would make for an interesting social experiment. What if a recently diagnosed individual told half of their friends and family about their diagnosis but didn't disclose it to the other half of their friends and family? How would the observations and opinions of both groups be shaped by witnessing the same behaviors with and without a corresponding label? But moving away from what other people think about us, I now want to touch on how we ourselves can struggle with that imposter syndrome of acting more autistic after a diagnosis. Frequency illusion can play a role in how we view things about ourselves too. I struggled with eye contact way before my diagnosis, but because I didn't focus on it, knowing it was a trait of autism, I don't really remember doing it as much before. After my initial discovery, I could only recall like 2 specific instances of this, and both had different reasons for standing out in my mind. The first was when my husband commented on it once because it carried painful misunderstandings of less love and intimacy. I didn't get the same reaction when I didn't make eye contact with the random store clerks and checkout lanes, so none of the other 1,000 times I did it stood out to me. And I only remember the second instance of someone pointing it out on a work Zoom call because of timing. That instance just so happened to take place like 2 weeks before that life-altering moment of me realizing I could be on the spectrum. Because I began recalling and connecting past behaviors to autism, and that had just recently happened, it got memorialized in the story of my discovery journey. Otherwise, I would have long forgotten about that instance too. Now that I know it's an autistic trait, I am overly cognizant of when I'm doing it, like 100% of the time. I now notice and remember when I can't make eye contact with the waiter, or when I'm making cognitive efforts to make it look like I'm looking at someone. Now that I'm taking note of it every single time, it could make me think I'm doing it more now. And now that I'm beginning to understand why I do so many of the things I do, it leads me to noticing autistic and ADHD behaviors in almost everything I do. Those little red vehicles are everywhere. They're in my restricted, repetitive behaviors, my introvertedness, my communication difficulties, my stimming, my inattention. They're in every breath I take and every move I make. Heck, I'm beginning to notice it in the people around me and trying not to diagnose my neighbors and solicitors that come to my door. So, am I doing these things more now, or am I noticing these things more now? And not only am I taking note of these things, but I've been trying to give myself more accommodations after my diagnosis as well. I say no to social activities more now and try to set personal boundaries more often. I give myself more alone time in order to recharge. I also allow myself to stim more, which includes moving my body back and forth when I'm sitting down. And I promise you, that would have been one I hid before my diagnosis. And my husband bought me a pair of loop earplugs that are attached to our car keys that I use if needed whenever I go out. But here's the thing. I stim and use my loop earplugs when no one is watching. So if I was just putting on an Oscar-worthy performance, I'm doing it wrong because I forgot the importance of having an audience to witness it. And finally, I want to talk about the feelings of personal guilt that some of us might feel when we begin unmasking and accommodating ourselves. We might feel like we're placing unfair burdens on those around us or being selfish because a lot of the behaviors autistic people engage in is isolating and can appear self-serving. Things like becoming absorbed in special interests or needing alone time. As a wife and a mother, when is hiding away in my bedroom necessary for recharging, and when is it unfair to my son and husband? It can be hard to strike that balance, and that too can make me feel guilty at times. I have laid my soul bare on this channel, and to be honest, there are some days I almost wish I hadn't received my diagnosis because I feel like I was trying harder before, and now I almost feel like I'm letting go too much, like I'm being lazy now and not trying as hard as I think I should be or something. Am I giving myself more grace, or am I gaining a flabby gut because the treadmill makes me uncomfy and I don't like it? And the fact that I'm ADHD is almost all I ever think about nowadays. Sometimes it feels like it's taken over my life in a way I wish it hadn't. But every time I have these thoughts, I always circle back around to the fact that realizing why I am the way I am alleviated so much pain and depression. So I do truly feel like this benefit alone outweighs everything else. I may not ever stop having those other thoughts, but I know that overall, getting diagnosed was a good thing. If you've ever had someone tell you that you're acting more autistic now, I'm sorry. I truly do wish I could reach out and give you a big hug. I'm lucky that I haven't had this happen to me yet, and my husband has been supportive enough that he almost doesn't know when he's over-accommodating me now. I'm not the only one who's struggling with proper adjusted behavior post-diagnosis, but I know there's a lot of people out there who may not have good support systems, and I just want to let you know I see you. After learning I had autism and ADHD, I had to start relearning who I was. Trying to take off the mask is a continual effort of learning who I am, and I still don't know what that is. Sometimes I feel like an amorphous being with no direction, and maybe that's okay. Maybe I don't have to have it all figured out and can focus on existing as a perfectly imperfect being. So I'll end it there. If you have any stories about someone telling you you're acting more autistic, or any story you'd be willing to share anonymously for a future video, I'd love to hear from you. Other than that, bye for now. Mwah!